Hello, seventh graders, and welcome again to my living room for another installment of our story of the early colonies. And last time, our story was about Peter Stuyvesant, a Dutch guy who came and settled Manhattan for the time being. And that story ended up being a little bit of a review of the English Civil War. We know that Charles sent his brother, the Duke of York, over. And so it wound up, started being a Dutch colony, but then eventually wound up being a British colony. Well, today we're going to look at another really interesting story, and this also is going to be a review of the English Civil War. And the star of our story is a guy whose name is William Penn, and he really is quite fascinating. I want to show you a map of the area we're looking at here, our 13 original colonies. And you'll see, move up a little bit here so we can get the glare out of there. And you're going to see here Pennsylvania, right here. Can you hear my cat meowing in the background? She hates it when I do this. But anyway, so here's Pennsylvania. And then just north of Pennsylvania, you can see Manhattan Island, settled as New Amsterdam, but then taken over by the Duke of York. So it became New York. And then you see the French colonies that surround this area, and that's going to come into play very soon in the French and Indian War, which is going to be at the beginning of George Washington's career. So if any of you have Quaker Oats in your house, when my kids were growing up, I always kept a big box of Quaker Oats. And Quaker Oats have a picture of William Penn on the cover, because William Penn was a Quaker. We're going to find out about it. Here's a picture of him. And I tried to find, I thought maybe stashed in the back of my pantry was a box of Quaker Oats, but I don't happen to have one now. So there's William Penn. And I really like the way Susan Bauer, once again, tells the story of William Penn. So I'm going to go ahead and read right from Susan Bauer. And you're going to see how this story is a review, once again, of the English Civil War, which you know a lot about now. While the colonies in New France and New England fought for survival, a man named William Penn was working hard to build a different kind of colony. Penn wanted this new colony, Pennsylvania, to be a place of peace, brotherhood, and love, not a place of war. But the history of Pennsylvania was filled with trouble. The story of Pennsylvania began in 1660, when William Penn was just 16 and studying at the University of Oxford. The English had just decided to invite Charles II back to England. And you remember that time, right? That was after Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan who ruled with draconian measures. So the people, Parliament particularly, were fed up, and they invited Charles II back, and it's called the what? Restoration of the monarchy. That's right. So William's father, an officer in the English Navy, commanded the ship that brought Charles II back to England. In gratitude, Charles II made William's father an admiral and a knight. So William Penn's dad is actually Admiral Penn. And when Charles II was crowned in London, Admiral Penn loaned him 16,000 pounds for his treasury, more money than a farmer or merchant might earn in his entire lifetime. Admiral Penn wanted William to have a position at the new royal court, perhaps as an ambassador or army officer. But in Oxford, William had started going to the meeting of a religious group called the Society of the Friends of the Truth. The Friends were nicknamed Quakers because people whispered that they quaked or shook in the presence of God. Quakers refused to belong to the Church of England. Instead, they gathered together in plain meeting houses where they sat and prayed quietly, waiting for God's word to come directly into their hearts. Quakers believed that every man and woman should be equal. So they refused to use the word you, because in those days, people used the word you when talking to superiors and thee when talking to equals. Quakers used "thee" when speaking to everyone. They wouldn't even take their hats off in the presence of the king. This looked a lot like rebellion, so Quakers were often arrested and put in jail. Admiral Penn didn't want William to become a Quaker, so he ordered William to come home from Oxford and sent him to France instead. In France, William met Louis XIV and learned French dress and French manners at that glittering, beautiful French court. And you remember talking about that a little bit, just the elaborate dress and Louis XIV, the Sun King, and that's where William hung out for a while. When he returned, he seemed content to lead the life of a wealthy aristocrat. He went to parties and balls. He decided to become a soldier and had his portrait painted in a full suit of armor. But while William was playing the part of a fashionable young man, he was still thinking about Quaker ideas. Soon, William Penn was going to Quaker meetings once more. At the age of 22, sitting in a Quaker meeting, William Penn was suddenly filled with joy. "The Lord visited me," he later said, with a certain sound and testimony of his eternal word. Now William could no longer be a soldier. Quakers believed that fighting was wrong. And do you know what that means when someone believes, what they're called when someone believes fighting is wrong? That would be a pacifist, and we have pacifists today. And he certainly wouldn't be a royal ambassador. Quakers were not in favor at court. When Admiral Penn found out that his son had become a Quaker, he was so furious that he threw William out of the house and told him not to come back. William Penn went to live with his friends in London. He wrote tracts defending Quaker beliefs, or little pamphlets defending Quaker beliefs, preached in public, and was thrown into jail. When he was released, he learned that his father was dying. William Penn hurried home to sit by his father's side. 10 days later, Admiral Penn died. William spent the next 3 years writing and thinking about Quaker ideas. Meanwhile, all over England, Quakers were put in jail because of their beliefs. William Penn knew that over North America, Puritans had formed colonies where they could worship as they pleased, and that would have been Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans, and then, of course, the Pilgrims or Separatists in Plymouth Plantation. Why couldn't Quakers have a colony as well? So William wrote to Charles II, reminding the king he still owed the Penn family £16,000. He asked for the king to pay him back, not with money, but with land in North America. Charles II agreed, and he insisted that the land be called Pennsylvania in honor of William's father. In 1861, he gave William Penn a piece of land on the western bank of the Delaware River for his very own. The land was almost as big as the country of England. William Penn planned to use this land for a colony where Quaker ideas could be followed. He wanted the settlers to be like brothers, all equal to each other. The capital city would be called the City of Brotherly Love. In Greek, Philadelphia. So Philos means love, and Delphia would be city, so City of Brotherly Love. The colonists would govern themselves. To help them, he wrote out directions called the Frame of Government that explained how the colonies could run. Colonists could vote to elect 3 groups of leaders: a council, an assembly, and a governor. And that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, with our 3 branches of government. This was the original sort of idea of 3 branches of government. And Thomas Jefferson actually said that William Penn was one of the most brilliant men that had ever lived. The council would make laws, the assembly would vote on whether or not the laws should be passed, and the governor would make sure that laws were followed. That way, no one group of people would have all the power. Later, this frame of government would be the model for the American Constitution. William Penn didn't forget about the Indians either, the Native Americans, which were mainly the Lenape tribe in that area. He sent them a message promising to pay them for any land that the colonists used. In the direction for his new colony, he wrote, "No man shall by any ways or means, in word or deed, affront or wrong any Indian. The Indian shall have liberty to do all things that any of the colonists shall enjoy." So that was great. That William Penn early on was really a crusader for Indian rights. In 1682, William Penn himself came over to Pennsylvania, bringing 100 colonists with him. In the next year, 23 different ships arrived, one at a time, bringing new settlers, 2,000 in all. But the governor of Maryland, the colony just south of Pennsylvania, watched Pennsylvania's growth with alarm. He thought that the Pennsylvania colonists were settling on land that ought to belong to Maryland. Just 2 years after William Penn's arrival, the Maryland governor announced he was going to sail to England and ask the king to give him part of Pennsylvania's land. And the name of that guy was Lord Baltimore. And you probably recognize that from the name of Baltimore, Maryland, right? The capital of Maryland. William Penn didn't want to leave his colony so soon, but he had no choice. He had to follow the Maryland governor back over to England and defend Pennsylvania's right to its land. So, sadly, he boarded a ship and set out on the long journey across the Atlantic. He would not return for 15 long years. When he arrived in England, he found that Charles II was too ill to see him. Not long after, Charles II died without leaving a son behind him. His brother, James II, claimed the throne. But James II was Catholic. The people of England were horrified. Did this mean that England would become a Catholic country again? And then something even more alarming happened. James II and his wife had a son. And you know this from the English Civil War. We've talked about this. They planned to raise this little boy to be a good Catholic and James' heir. Now England might be facing a whole dynasty of Catholic kings. The English Protestants revolted. They sent a message to James' older daughter. Who was that? Remember? That was Mary, who lived in Holland. Mary was a Protestant, and she was married to a Dutch nobleman. And who was that? That was William, right? William III of Orange. Both were Protestants. "Come to England and seize the throne," the English Protestants pleaded. "Be king and queen and deliver us from Catholic rule." William and Mary agreed to come. They also agreed to sign a paper promising they would not try to pass any laws without approval of Parliament. What is the name of that paper? You know, it is the English Bill of Rights. In November of 1688, they sailed to England along with 14,000 Protestant soldiers. As soon as they landed, James' royal army deserted him and welcomed the new Protestant rulers. James, like his brother before him, had to flee to France. The Protestants of England were delighted. They now had a Protestant king and queen who had promised not to be tyrants. The English called this takeover the, what? That's it, the Glorious Revolution. Their new monarchs, Mary and William, would never try to seize power from Parliament. And as you know, that established British parliamentary rule, just like we have today. But the revolution wasn't so glorious for William Penn. He was arrested 3 times because he was suspected of loyalty to the king. Each time he was released, he tried to get a ship to take him back to Philadelphia and failed. Finally, he was forced to go into hiding. He stayed in hiding for years and years. Finally, when fears of James II's return began to die down, William was able to come out of hiding and buy passage on a ship to North America. When he walked down its gangplank in the harbor of Philadelphia, he could hardly believe his eyes. In 15 years, Philadelphia had grown to be the second largest town in all of North America. The city was filled with shops, tall brick houses, wide streets, and thousands of people. The holy experiment had succeeded. Today, a statue of William Penn stands on top of Philadelphia's City Hall. The statue is 37 feet tall. For many years, no building in Philadelphia was allowed to be taller than the brim of the statue's hat, so that William Penn would always be the highest spot in the city he planned. And let me go ahead and show you a picture of that building in Philadelphia, on top of Philadelphia's City Hall. This is, they call him Billy Penn, and he sits up there today on top of City Hall. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you, just to bring back some old stories that we've talked about, is I wanted to show you a map of the early plans of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is between two rivers. It's between the Schuylkill River here and the Delaware River. And here is the very, very really organized plan of the city. It was organized in a grid pattern, and the purpose of that was William Penn had lived through another round of the Great Plague, coming back through London, and also the Great Fire of London. So he did not want any alleyways or tiny sort of filthy areas in the city. He wanted very broad streets, broad venues, so that there could be like no congested wooden buildings. And many of the buildings were actually brick. And the pattern there was as a result of his past experiences, but also set a pattern for cities in the future in America. And that was big, broad streets and organized in a grid. So anyway, I am going to go ahead and send you the notes for this story. And this will be the last story we're going to talk about in the early colonies. So review your notes, and then next time I'll go ahead and send you a little quiz. Very simple little quiz. I'm sure you guys are all going to do really well. And I also want to tell you, I really appreciate what a great job you're doing on your notes. You're using color to separate your thoughts. The kids who tend to be neat are continuing to be neat. The ones who are not quite so neat are working on that. And so thank you for that. And it makes me think that I'm sort of in touch with you, because I miss seeing you in class. But hopefully we're going to be back May 1st, and that'll be great. So anyway, copy your notes, send me a picture, which I will look forward to getting, and enjoy this story. Okay, very good. Bye-bye.